Yes! Video game. I managed some time in March to play through the third and final game of this bizarre series of JRPGs, and yeah, that story sure went somewhere. Unlike what I did in the previous episodes, I'll mention the gameplay related things first, as the story definitely feels like it deserves to be kept for last. It's like saving the best part of the meal, if the meal was the New Testament. In a lot of ways, Xenosaga 3 is easily the best in the trilogy. I mean that visually, musically, and gameplay-wise. It seems Monolith Soft finally struck a proper balance between the overall anime look from the first game and the more realistic style from the second. And I think that the style that's shown in this third game is definitely the sweet spot. I mean, everyone looks great. Environments are also more fleshed out and not as sterile as before, which makes exploring way more endearing. I'm a sucker for beach areas, but the forests and even ruined cities felt extremely refreshing after 2 games of mostly samey environments. The game really looks like it could be an early 7th gen game, which, coming out in 2006, doesn't surprise me. I honestly think at points it looks even better than a lot of things in Xenoblade Chronicles, despite that game having the better world. The soundtrack is also both improved and slightly worse in certain points. The most annoying thing is the fact that there's silence again for certain areas. I get that people complain about Episode 2's soundtrack, which is probably why they changed it, but I bitched about that point enough already in the other videos, and I can't be too mad because the music that is there is composed by Yuki Kajiura. Apparently she did work for Episode 2 as well, but here I finally recognize her work, as many tracks had a similar vibe to those in Fate Zero. A show you should watch, by the way, it's fantastic. And so is the music, cause holy fuck! Yeah, I can't really complain too much about the music if we get that shit. Even the battle theme, which I haven't been too fond of in past games, I mean, it fucking slaps. So my biggest concern going into Xenosaga 3, aside from the direction of its story, was the gameplay and pacing. Pacing has been better, the start and the end are still front-loaded with cutscenes, but it felt like I got a good chunk of actual game out of the middle. I find it bizarre that out of the 9 chapters, Chapter 8 and 9 take up Disc 2, and they essentially felt almost as long as the entirety of chapters 1 through 7. I can only imagine the equivalent to this being like, ah, yes, let me read the final chapter of Lord of the Rings. Wait, why do I still have half the book left? Not really a fault with the game, obviously, just a bit amusing in my opinion. Gameplay outside of combat hasn't changed much. 3D maps to explore are not really an overworld aside from a tiny map for one area. Items, gold, and shops are back, thank God. Even turn-based combat has been rather simple, but in a good way this time. You still have attacks, ether spells, enemies with elemental weaknesses, the ability to change characters on the fly, and a boost gauge to sneak in an extra turn. Like Episode 1, boosts can also be used for super attacks, and like Episode 2, you can break enemies to punish them when their guard is down. Unlike Episode 1 and 2 though, you can't string multiple attacks together. You just select a move from the menu and that's it. Even breaking enemies just requires to fill the meter this time, and there are special moves that focus on breaking, that you can simply select and execute. Yeah, and that's really it. Essentially just a combat system with attacks and magic spells and a boost and break meter. I get that big fans of the series may be let down by the simplicity, but I really like it. What also helps is that you can skip attack and victory animations, which makes battles flow immensely well. That was a problem I had with Episode 1 and 2, I didn't even realize, but now, oh my god, you can fight so fast, and grinding is not an issue at all. Wow, I really didn't realize I wanted a solution to that. I didn't even realize it was a problem, but thank you, Monolith. Yeah. I'm really glad you fixed that for the last game. Also, this is not to say that combos are gone entirely. The ES returns from Episode 2, the giant mech that you pilot in certain sections. Here again, it's very context sensitive, only to be used in certain areas. But they can carry equipment now, and also the stats are based on the character's level, and they don't have their own levels. Which was an issue that I kind of had in Episode 2. Also, they have way more extensive use and fun boss fights, and fighting levels up the characters, not the mechs. And there is kind of a best way of equipping them. Regardless though, customizing them is fun, and doesn't feel arbitrary this time around. And speaking of customizing, so in Xenosaga 2, I complained about the way to grow your characters, and I suggested the following. What if we ditched the system and only had experience and S points, and unlocking skills was tied to level progression? I think in any other game that would have resulted in a more natural character building aspect. Well, fuck me, either I must be a time traveler, or they thought that was a good idea as well, because imagine my surprise when I found out Episode 3 did exactly that. You just gain experience, gold, and S points. You unlock abilities naturally, and unlock additional perks and skills in a skill tree unique to that character. And that's it. Yeah, obviously I was very pleased about that, and I laughed a bit when I found out that what I had mentioned in my Episode 2 review just is exactly how Episode 3 was structured. Maybe I do know some things. I think the only thing gameplay-wise that I didn't really enjoy was the fact that side quests felt kinda just thrown in there. I mean, they were basically all but gutted from the game. There's like 2 optional bosses and this lemming-ass minigame that's way too expensive. There's like 60 levels to this shit and a stage builder and everything. What the fuck? There's a couple characters as well that you can speak on to the Elsa and in the town for some good gear, but I wouldn't have minded the Good Samaritan system again. That made tracking side quests so much easier. Okay, so essentially, this is a good, fast-paced, satisfying to play JRPG, with great visuals and some excellent music. That is about as much as I can say without going into the lore things and gameplay spoilers. If you played the first 2 games and are interested in this, but haven't found your hands on a copy or something, just find a way, play it. Most likely the best that you'll play from this series. But I have to talk about the story now, and for the story, I'm gonna go a bit off rail and just ad-lib my way through it, because this is such an insane narrative that there's no way that I can properly plan a script to talk about the story. Things just happen. You just kind of have to accept it. It's a trip. It's a journey. You'll see. So, at the end of Episode 2, the Zohar was basically kidnapped by this giant ship that's apparently a Gnosis. I didn't even know that when I played it. Especially because Episode 2 barely had any Gnosis, they just weren't there. Giant one suddenly shows up, steals the source of the power of God, and fucks off. Whatever. Episode 2 starts like a year later, and Shion is breaking into the base of operations of her employer, Vector. That really surprised me, because I was going to assume that we were going to have like a flashback or anything telling us why this was happening. She didn't seem to be on bad terms with Vector at the end of Episode 2. Turns out you do not get that flashback. There's this page somewhere at the start of the game where you can, in the menu, where you can read about everything that happens in the year between the start of Episode 3 and the end of Episode 2. Making me really think, wow, they definitely cut corners, turning what was originally supposed to be a 6-episode narrative into a trilogy. They're really like trying to just cram that shit in. Whatever, I read it, I hoped it wasn't going to be important. They reference it a bunch, so please read that. If you start the game, please read that narrative. They even like summarize Episode 1 and 2, and even though I think that's a shit way to experience the stories, if you have to, you can. Apparently, Shion found out in that year that her dad and her employer Vector were connected to the religious cult group, the u-tic, and she didn't like that, and that's why she left, and she's breaking into their base of operations to find information. Well, I wonder what they were hiding. And also a man named Grimoire enabled acts of Gnosis terrorism, where he guided the Gnosis to populated areas to attack it. That is barely mentioned again and such a footnote in the story, which is bizarre to me, that Gnosis terrorism is a footnote that's like, yeah, just a thing that happens. It's basically all an excuse to make Shion distrust her own father and Vector. That's really the only thing that this narrative is for. So after she breaks in, she finds something in regards to Project Canaan. And Canaan is one of our, not party members, but one of the group that we travel with. Obviously, there's connections there, but they don't really get like followed up on until much later in the story. It is at this point that the story basically branches off into two different directions. First, the Elsa, the spaceship that all our crew members hang out on in the first game, finds a floating landmass that was connected to the Lost Jerusalem, which is essentially Earth that got lost through time. So a part of Earth is essentially floating in space, and they're like, oh, let's investigate it. But then they get sucked in, and they can't escape anymore. So all the important party members weren't on the ship somehow, but they go and visit Shion, along with a character named Alan, who's basically now just doing Shion's old work at Vector. And Alan is a character that was in episode 1 and 2, and I didn't really talk about much because he really wasn't important at that point. He's basically a simp for Shion and just flusters his words in regards to everything when communicating with her, because he likes her and he doesn't know how to tell it, and he's shy and blah 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 blah. You can tell I really didn't give a fuck about Alan, because it's this comic relief character in this series of JRPGs with these very existential Nietzsche-inspired themes. Yeah, I don't give a fuck. Maybe if this was a rom-com, which it isn't, so I don't understand why he's here, but he plays a role later on in episode 3, so that's why I'm finally introducing him here. Shion basically meets with Alan and the party members, and they're like, hey, we're trapped. Our friends are trapped at the Lost Jerusalem plates in the sky. Can you help us? I was like, oh, well, we need KOS-MOS for that. So let's go see how KOS-MOS is doing. And they basically go to the Vector weapon development area, where they showcase KOS-MOS and two new developments. One is Omega, which is a giant mech based on the remains of the final boss of episode 2, to which I reply, why the fuck would you make that? I had such a bitch of a time trying to kill him in episode 2 and just rebuild him. It's gonna go wrong. It's obviously gonna be a boss fight. Don't do that. But the other thing that they made was a robot called t-elos, which looks very similar to KOS-MOS, and it is at this point where I also looked at her design, looked at how fan servicey and sexy it was, and I was like, oh, okay, am I playing a hentai? Is that what's happening right now? What's going on? But they basically like they test the performance of both units, and obviously t-elos wins because t-elos has newer hardware. Obviously she would win. It's like, oh, I wonder which is more powerful, the Steam Deck or the Switch. It's the Steam Deck. Of course it's the Steam Deck. There's no fucking contest there. Both have their uses, but come on. So because t-elos outperforms KOS-MOS in an extreme way, they decide, okay, you know what, we're gonna scrap KOS-MOS. Obviously, Shion doesn't want that, so they steal her and proceed to go to the plates. At the plates, they basically have an encounter with the Testaments, who are finally brought back in again after episode 2. And also t-elos again. They revealed that their mechs basically have something called anima in them, which is very necessary for their plans. And t-elos then proceeds to beat the shit out of KOS-MOS. Shion, who at this point is also collapsing very often, and everyone thinks like, oh, she's probably fatigued. I don't know why everyone think that after like 3 times collapsing. That's not fatigue anymore. There's something going on. You should probably consult someone. They don't do that, which is aggravating as fuck. Anyway, Shion, seeing KOS-MOS get beaten the fuck out of her, obviously doesn't like that, so she reacts in a certain way, and then they get teleported 15 years in the past. To which I was just like, alright, time travel, whatever. I think we've like traveled into memories before. Why, sure, why not? Why not time travel, you know? This fucking plot is already going insane. So, we're 15 years back in the past on the first Miltia, which is also the planet that basically was lost in episode 2 and that we had to find again. And Episode 2 also started with the fall of Miltia, basically everything going to shit. We find out that Shion's father was working with Momo's father on trying to control the Zohar, the connection of energy to Udo, which is a godlike entity. So obviously this experiment goes horribly wrong, and the u-tic sends in Realians that are not properly designed, which start fucking killing everyone, turning the whole of Miltia 1 into an absolute hellscape. This traumatizes a young Shion to such an extent that her trauma connects to the Zohar and then proceeds to create and release the Gnosis, basically making her the cause of the Gnosis problem. It is also at this point that the father of Momo realizes, oh wow, we really fucked up, and he seals away the planet, which is how that whole sequence of events basically happened. One of the testaments is revealed to be Virgil, which we all already kind of knew after episode 1, and he was completely gone from episode 2, so a very weird time to bring that up again. Virgil reveals that he had a connection in the past with one of the Realians, and also shows us more of why he has this hatred towards Realians to begin with. At the end though, you fight him, and then the ghost of the Realian he liked shows up and apparently takes him back to heaven. Yeah, sure, I mean, that's not the first time I've seen someone ascend to heaven in this series, so I guess that can just happen. And it also is revealed that the Red Testament is in fact Shion's ex-lover, Kevin. And he keeps asking her, hey, you wanna join my sick cult and probably ruin the world? To which she annoyingly replies, yeah, probably. To which everyone else replies, no, don't fucking do that, Shion. Or what are you, fucking daft? What are you, a fucking idiot? It is also pretty much earlier revealed that the Black Testament is a character called Voyager, which is the arch nemesis and serial killer, I think, of Ziggy, but that is really not important until later in the story. And the White Testament is Albedo, like I expected. Not surprised by that at all, but again, not really important until much later in the story. It is also at this point revealed that they didn't travel back in time, but they rather traveled into Shion's subconscious, and I actually kind of like that they did that, because it is an interesting twist. We're not just stuck in the past, even though traveling back in someone's subconscious may have caused events in the past. I don't understand how that works. Regardless, traveling into people's minds has been something that's established since the very first episode, so the fact that that can happen, that completely flies. I don't understand how that can change events in the past to the future, because characters do interact with each other. So they leave Shion's subconscious, and obviously she's emotionally traumatized as fuck. The person she thought was her lover, she thought was dead, turned out to be alive, and is trying to take her to the dark side, to which she's very willingly, yeah, sure, why not? She also realizes that she's responsible for a lot of death in the universe, because she caused the Gnosis to happen. And a lot of shit basically around Shion, where it's just like, oh, how could she have done that? She's so important, showing me that the writers had a lot of appeal for her, and I kind of feel that appeal is misplaced. It is at this point that kind of a filler arc happens, where Junior's dad suddenly shows up, Yuriev, and decides, you know what, I don't like Udo, the power of God. He scares me. I'm gonna try and, kill him, or take over, or become a god myself. So he basically steals the Omega and a bunch of the animas inside of the ES mechs, with the intent of like, hey, I'm gonna use the Zohar emulators to become a god myself. And it's this whole elaborate scheme where he combines a bunch of shit to become powerful, and you basically go there and immediately stop him. So I don't understand what the fuck the deal was with that. He also basically took over Junior's brother Guinan, and Albedo then, as a White Testament, also shows up to prevent this. And this is basically just I feel like they really wrote themselves in the corner here, because it's basically an excuse to have both him, Guinan, and Albedo vanish from the story because they like clash. Albedo's soul or consciousness gets thrown into Junior, and Guinan and his father Yuriev basically disappear and die. And it feels weird to just like mention it like that, but it really like feels like it has no importance to the story other than writing these characters off, and perhaps maybe also concentrating most of like the divine artifacts that we've been looking for along with the Zohar into one place. The giant Gnosis, which I think is called the Abel, then shows up, takes the Zohar again to the planet Michtim, which is the starting ground of the Ormus, which was the other holy conspiracy theory group. First of all, in the previous review, I mentioned that like there was a conspiracy group succeeding each and every single one, even though I now realize that they were more at odds with each other than I thought. They weren't just like layered on top of each other. Doesn't really help though, because apparently Wilhelm, the CEO of Vector, also in charge of a lot of the Federation, is also the secret cult leader of the Ormus, which they also guide the immigrant fleet and the u-tic. So at this point, when you're asking like, oh, who's behind it all, it's Wilhelm. Which he looked evil to begin with, and he was commanding the Testaments, which was the other group, but essentially, somehow, he managed to get everywhere at the top of the chain, and he's guiding all these different forces to clash with each other, just to find all these divine artifacts for him. And I'm just like, if you have control over basically the entire universe at this point, why does there need to be conflict at all? Why don't you just say, oh, you bring this shit to me? That's extremely weird. Something feels like... It feels like something went wrong with the writing there. Regardless, Margulis from the Ormus and u-tic organization finds out and obviously is crushed because like, oh wow, my pope, my leader is a fucking liar, so his faith is in shambles. You eventually go to the Holy Land of the Ormus because that's where the Zohar is, and then you encounter Margulis, who's basically like, yeah, fuck, I don't even give a shit anymore. I'm gonna try and kill you, and you better kill me, otherwise I have nothing to live for anymore. And obviously you kill him. Very sad way to see someone like that go. Like basically, like you keep fighting a religious fanatic, and the time you beat him is when he lost his faith. Interesting parallel for all the religious talk in this video game. Kanan elaborates a bit more on his backstory, and that the Project Kanan at the very start that Shion found when she broke into the Vector headquarters is that he was a Realian made to spy on people. But, you know, he turns because he likes us so much, I guess. And then they find Voyager, who's basically Ziggy's arch nemesis, who's like, oh yeah, I didn't want to die, I wanted to be above death, so that's why I became a testament. At this point where you essentially find a giant fucking Wikipedia room based on the events of Pied Piper, which is the whole backstory of Ziggy. So again, a whole fucking game is basically relegated to a text wall. Hey, you should probably read this if you want more information on these characters. Yeah, okay. Anyway, Voyager is a classic, like, villain who's just like, haha, I'm evil and I don't want to die. And then Kanan, you know, restores his trust in us because he takes him down with him and then they die. I didn't give a shit about Voyager. Voyager was such a boring villain to be. Near the end of the game, where a bombshell is dropped in terms of the narrative, and I just have to, like, okay, this is the biggest twist of this game, and I have to mention this. If somehow you listen to all of this and you still want to play this game, this is the moment to click off. They find t-elos at the end, where she reveals that KOS-MOS is essentially the resurrected soul or spirit of Mary Magdalene. And t-elos is the body of Mary Magdalene, and they have to fuse to be the last holy relic that is needed, because Wilhelm wants to basically reset the universe because he's afraid that it will eventually end, and the only way he sees to fix that is to just reset everything. And apparently this is not the first time he's done that. Also, this is where we finally get the backstory and chaos that I've wanted so long. His name is Yeshua. He was apparently best friends with, I shit you not, Jesus Christ. So we have KOS-MOS, who's essentially Mary Magdalene. Chaos, who is an apostle and the best friend of, actually, legitimately, Jesus Christ. And it is at this point that I bursted out laughing because I couldn't fucking believe what I was seeing. And all these like parallels and dumb like jokes kept coming to my mind, and it was just insane. Jesus was able to somehow convey Udo's energy, which I guess is why he was seen as the son of God. Okay, I know this series had religious inspiration and was gonna have religious symbolism. I didn't think it was gonna be the actual fucking religion. When I said at the start that this was the New Testament, I wasn't kidding. Jesus Christ, in anime form, in JRPG, glorious anime form, actually shows up and starts talking. If KOS-MOS and Jesus actually, I don't know, had a kid at this point, because the game very much alludes to the fact that they were lovers, this would be the JRPG equivalent to the Da Vinci Code, wouldn't it? If this was a more popular game, I think Christians would have been fucking rioting. It's also just insane to me comprehending any of this shit, because it's like, what if I bought like a body pillow of KOS-MOS or t-elos, and what if you did? What if you bought like an anime figurine and it gets delivered and your Christian parents are just like, what the hell is this? What are you buying this smut for? And you're just like, no, that's Mary Magdalene. This is a holy figure. Do not commit sacrilege against my waifu, father and mother. I can just imagine church at this point just having figurines of this on their altar, just like worshipping this. Oh, pray, Holy Mary, give me a fun game. Give me a fun time at a JRPG. I know that there's like usually like a secretive character in a JRPG. Like I think Xenoblade Chronicles has Elvis, and I know what's up with him. But could you just imagine if at the end of Xenoblade Chronicles he just said, "Yeah, Shok, did you know I'm best friends with the Prophet Muhammad?" It's like, no, I didn't know that. You know why? That's fucking stupid. So yeah, that broke any little sanity I had left at that point, and I still had a couple hours to go. t-elos gets beaten, and KOS-MOS basically absorbs her into her own body, basically making her Mary Magdalene again. I can't believe I'm fucking saying that still. But in a good way and not an evil way. They are confronted by the Red Testament, Kevin again, who's at this point the only remaining Testament, if I'm sure. Yeah, Albedo got sucked up by Junior. Voyager got killed by Kanan, and Virgil fucked off himself to the afterlife. He knows what's up. He saw the ending of this game. He's like, nah, I'm fucking out. It is at this point that I genuinely started hating Shion. Because Kevin is again like, hey, you wanna, do evil shit together? And he basically frames it as like, hey, we can live together and be happy. You just have to, like, trust us and basically fuck the universe for this time loop. And she's like, yeah, sure, let's do that. And everyone's like, no, don't do that. Everyone will essentially die and be, reincarnated, but we don't want that. We want to save this universe if we can. He's just like, no, you know what? I trust him. I love him. He knows what's best for me. Constantly. Because, me is sad and everything, and she doesn't feel like anyone has been able to make her happy like he has. And a whole bunch of shit, and I know love makes blind, but like, holy fucking shit, I was so done with this character at this point. It is also here where Alan, declares his love, but also is like, hey, don't be such a cunt. Kevin starts hurting him, and Shion, obviously, seeing her friend get hurt, is like, oh, maybe I don't want that. It's basically like, if you have ever seen Return of the Jedi, it's at the end where Darth Vader, it's like, oh, the Emperor's killing my son, I should probably stop that. And in this case, Shion's like, oh, he's killing my simp. I should have probably stopped that. And they do. Jin, Shion's brother, at this point was also like, yeah, I'm fucking done with you, Shion. I know you're my sister and everything. If you go through with this, I'm gonna fucking stab you. Which, that also made me, like, elevate Jin. I already liked the sword techniques, and he was just, like, kind of a calm, cool dude. And that made me go, like, oh, you know what, Jin? You know what's up. Fucking hell yeah, thumbs up. Obviously though, Shion changes her mind because the plot demands it. If she really was as blind for him as she indicated, then I don't think she would have given a shit that her simp died, but no. Seeing your simp get tortured, who wants that? Who really wants that? So she rescues Alan from certain death, and they basically stop Kevin, and then they proceed to Wilhelm, who is about to like reset the universe with a machine called Zarathustra, which is based on the title of the game and also the poem by Nietzsche, I think. Wilhelm is basically like, hey Shion, you have the necklace to start all this shit, and I have all the divine artifacts, and I also have Mary Magdalene, not in the way I wanted, but in a way that will work. So can you activate the device? Shion's like, no. And then he's like, are you sure? I'm gonna torture you. And he proceeds to. At which point he asks KOS-MOS, he's like, hey, Mary, can you activate the device? Because that's what I programmed you to do. And KOS-MOS obviously now having a personality and feelings. Because it's Mary Magdalene and not just a robot anymore. It's like, no, then destroys the activation key, which is the necklace that Shion had been carrying. Then they fight to kill Wilhelm, but he's like, oh well, shit, now all the Gnosis are coming towards us and the whole planet is gonna, the whole universe is gonna get erased. And then KOS-MOS, Chaos, and Jin stay behind and use the device to like basically halt the destruction of the universe for a couple centuries, whilst the rest of the group escapes. Jin dies in a death that he did not deserve, because he was like one of the most level-headed characters this entire game. And then he decides that, you know what, I should probably help you keep off these horrible Gnosis. To his credit, he definitely helped out and barely managed to edge out to activate the halting destruction of the universe, but also basically sacrificing all of them in the process. The explosion of energy that results from this basically shuts down the UMN network, which is what allowed lightspeed travel to function. They basically decided, like, okay, you know what? To prevent the universe from destroying itself, we have to find the location of Earth, the Lost Jerusalem. So Shion Jr. and Alan decide to go and explore, while Momo and Ziggy stays behind to try and rebuild things. And that's where it ends. Yeah, I didn't really know how to feel about that ending, because this was definitely made in a way to like cap off the series. Like the end credits and everything show us as such. But the end of the universe is very near, and whether or not our group finds it, again, there's no light speed travel anymore. They have to find this manually in the ship, explore the entire universe to find Earth somewhere manually to find a solution to this problem. Yeah, that's, you know, that's kind of difficult. And whether they do or not, that's up to your own imagination. And you do see, like, the wreckage of KOS-MOS in, like, a post-credit scene fly towards the Lost Jerusalem, implying, like, oh, maybe, you know, they'll find her there, and they will solve the issue. But it's kind of left an open ending, and I appreciate open endings. In movies, something like Inception, you know, dream space, is it real or is it not? Trying to, like, keep you guessing. Obviously, it's gonna have, like, a ambiguous ending. There's games with ambiguous endings, like the Souls series have ambiguous endings, which they're ambiguous to begin with, so that's fine with me. And there's some other games with Final Fantasy VII has a bit of an ambiguous ending. You don't really know what happened to the rest of the crew, all you know is that the planet survived, and I think that works because their character arcs are kind of done at that point. I suppose you could argue that that's the case here. They killed all the bad guys, they stopped the universe from resetting, and they resolved their own issues. However, Shion is still connected to Udo. Shion is still sick, because previously the headaches that she kept having and fainting, that was because of her connection to Udo. Apparently she was very sensitive to that, and that would result in her having the same illness as her mother, and basically a death sentence. This is like an illness that you can't escape from, because this godlike entity is gonna fucking drive you nuts. So that doesn't get resolved. She all of a sudden falls for Alan when he protects her and stands manly in front of her with a gun. So, you know, all it took for her to like him is for him to not be a simp for 10 seconds and to like stand like a man, which I found very insulting witnessing this story. It's like, oh, okay, so like, man, you know, he's a simp. You know, for a simp, he's kind of pathetic, and he's played for comic relief. I just find it weird that Shion is suddenly like, oh, you know what, I like him because he was manly for 10 seconds. That's all it took. And it's like, this is the same woman who was so blinded by love for X that she was about to doom the universe. No questions asked. And 10 seconds of manliness from her simp is what it took. And it's like, ah, okay, fuck you. And the game ended. There's this point where I start like summarizing what has essentially happened. And I realized that there's a lot of needless complexity to the story. And there's a lot of things that didn't need to be there. All those political groups, essentially, to summarize, I could tell you, yeah, Wilhelm was behind it. And that would be it. The reveal of Chaos and KOS-MOS, I wanted answers. Why is KOS-MOS so important on the cover, aside from, you know, drawing you in to buy the product? If she's just a robot, she doesn't really feel interesting. Why do they keep alluding to, like, a mystery? Her being Mary Magdalene was a fucking reveal, alright? I'll remember that until my dying day. I don't know if that's the answer I wanted, to be fair, but I suppose it was an answer. Chaos being best friends with Jesus, yeah, and, you know, it's like the bonus chicken nuggets with the burger, right? It's like, oh yeah, he knows Jesus, we all know Jesus in this group. The use of the anima and the Zohar and everything, basically just like, hey, we need all these different elements to reset time. Okay, it felt like a lot of like, okay, how can we combine as much of the elements that we have in a story into one to give like a satisfying conclusion? But it doesn't really feel satisfying because I feel we could have told the same story more effectively with less elements. If this was just a story about the Zohar, that would have made so much more sense. KOS-MOS could have been fucking anyone aside from Mary Magdalene and would have made more sense. What's also really funny to me is that as far as gameplay is concerned, the end game was very not difficult, and you might be thinking, oh, why am I not explaining this in the gameplay section? Well, I wanted to give like a bit of context to some of the optional bosses, because I did everything in this game as far as I could play. I didn't do every level of that Lemmings game, because I couldn't really be bothered with that, but aside from that, the general main game, I did everything. Every optional boss, every side quest. I was very glad to see that the Air of the Kaiser came back. Essentially, you get one near the start of the game, and it's an extremely useful tool. It basically breaks the game because breaking is still a very effective method in damaging enemies, and Air of the Kaisers basically fill up the gauge entirely. There's safe crystals all around, so you're never really out of ether points to cast it with. And then you don't get just like that Air of the Kaiser, you get another one. And then another one. And if you beat the optional boss, you get a fourth one, which is just as damaging as the Air of the Kaiser from the first game. Which was insane to me. That basically we have all these grand reveals of all these characters, and you just cast the Air of the Kaiser and you're done. The bosses at the end were a fucking joke. If you did the optional boss beforehand, you could just like cast that spell. And you could cast it with everyone this time, and not just once per battle. That was the limitation of the Air of the Kaiser in the first game, where you could only cast it once per battle, and only one character had it, which was basically Shion for me. In this game, you could just cast it whenever, and it does have a high AP cost, but even then, there were accessories that could have, or even bring down your AP cost to just 1. KOS-MOS at one point, just every spell only cost 1. She had a boost, so if she wanted to, she could just have a turn of like 3 or 4 times casting the strongest Air of the Kaiser. Now, there's nothing in that game that survives even 2 hits of that, let alone 4. So, as far as difficulty goes, Xenosaga 3 was like the easiest one of all. But I do have to say, at the end of it all, it was a very personal narrative. When I sat there after I had beaten it and listened to the title screen for a bit, I did feel something. There were like hints of a story that really could have moved me if it wasn't so dragged down by a lot of the ridiculous elements and also the complexity of it. In regards to the developments, I often heard that Monolith Soft has been overburdened by their own ambition, and I really felt that with this game, and I heard the way that they tackled development for Xenoblade Chronicles was very different. They didn't just try to tackle all of it at once. They basically tackled, okay, just one aspect, just one area we're going to tackle. That's what we're going to work out. And when that's like finished to the point of like perfection, of like a finished product essentially, that's when we'll tackle the next bit. And that's basically helped them plan a lot. Their ambition really was a big enemy. So it was a very memorable experience for me. Feel the growing pains of a company. And I haven't really played much of Xenoblade Chronicles. I want to. I played halfway through the first one and I stopped. Not because the game was at fault, but just I wasn't in the mood for an RPG anymore at that point. But I'm definitely gonna go back into that with a very refreshed perspective. Do I think, in the end, that Xenosaga is worth playing? Maybe. If you're okay with a more old school type of JRPGs and you can sit through a ton of cutscenes, I mean a ton of cutscenes, and expect a narrative as insane as this. I mean, if you're listening to this, you already know what's gonna happen, so that might even, I don't know, help or deter you from playing it, who knows. I had a good time here. And especially part 3. This went from an okay game, which was definitely what Episode 1 was an okay game, Episode 2 was a mediocre game. This was the best. This was a good game with an insane narrative. I can't state that enough. And that is all I have to say about the Xenosaga series. Thank you all for listening, to those who stuck around this long. I hope that this weird way of delivering the message was something you can enjoy. And I'll see you all for the next video, whenever that may be.